Hi, everybody, and welcome to another Tundra Connections live chat. I'm Alysa McCall at Polar Bears International, and we are coming to you today from Polar Bears International House in the polar bear capital of the world, Churchill, Manitoba. And today is kind of a special event. I'm really just so thrilled to be a small part of this. I'll just set it up and then I'm going to actually step off camera for these two wonderful women to chat. I'm sitting next to Georgina Berg, a local Churchillian who is very knowledgeable about many things, including polar bears, and my friend and former colleague, KT Miller. And KT has recently defended her master's thesis. Congratulations, KT. She worked with Georgina for years documenting human polar bear relationships in Churchill, Manitoba. And so today we're talking about community connections, living with polar bears, all the knowledge that this community has and that Georgina has, and just talking a bit about the project. So it's a really just a beautiful piece of work, and we're really happy to be able to showcase it today. If you do have questions for KT or Georgina today, please do put them in the chat wherever you're watching. If you're on YouTube, polarbearsinternational.org, explore.org, Facebook, we have moderators that are checking all the different places and sending the questions on to us. We'll chat for about half an hour today, give or take a little bit. And thank you for joining us. And with that, I'll basically just throw it right over to KT. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here today.
Thanks so much, Alysa. I'm just so thrilled. Anytime I get to chat with Georgina is just a treat. And I'm so grateful to the community and to Georgina for working on this research project with me together. So this research project is in collaboration with Royal Roads University, which is where I'm a master's student, as well as Polar Bears International and Environment and Climate Change Canada, who provided the funding to make this research possible. So I just want to give a huge shout out and thank you to all of those organizations. And to just start things off, Georgina, could I just pass it to you to introduce yourself a little bit and tell people, a little bit about who you are and how you ended up getting involved in this project?
Good morning, KT, and nice to see you again. Well, I grew up here in Churchill. I went to school here in Churchill, and I've lived with these beautiful polar bears all my life. When KT was looking for a co-producer for the research project, she asked if I would join her, which I gladly said yes, because she was doing in such a fascinating way that was so natural to the Indigenous people here, which is storytelling. We'll talk more about that later, but I've been a teacher in the community for 20 plus years. I've retired recently, and I was kind of like at the fork in the road, and then I met KT Miller, who asked me to help her with this project, and I'm so thankful for her to offer that to me, and we've had a great time putting this project together.
Yeah, it truly has been a joy, and thank you to Albert behind the scenes running all the techers. Are there any bears on the cam right now, Albert, by chance? It's a special time in Churchill, as all of you know, this time when the bears gather along the shoreline. And Georgina, could you just share a little bit about what it's like to live in Churchill when, this is going on out on the tundra right now as we speak?
Well, there's many experiences that, growing up in a community with polar bears. There's lots of stories you could tell. One that I'll share with you was just last night. I was heading to bed a little early, and so I wasn't feeling good, and I could hear the bear bangers going outside my house, and I could hear it, but I wasn't well enough to get up. And a few minutes later, I did get up to look out the window, and there's all these strobe lights going out. They were looking for the bear. They probably had lost it and were looking out for it. So as I go back to lay down to sleep, I thought, oh, I hope they find it because I need to go to bed. But that's just one of the stories that, growing up in Churchill, you'd hear.
And one of the interesting things that came out of our research was just how much of a way of life it is to live with the bears in Churchill. Um, and, surprisingly, so many of the stories had a lot of humor and even joy. And people were very respectful, but there wasn't a lot of fear in the stories, which is just so unique, I think. So, kind of back to this research project, what we sort of tried to do is look at sort of this intersection between Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous histories with a lot of polar bear relevant history. So, Georgina's granddaughter actually designed these amazing maps as part of our research project. And so there's a very cool map that she made of the Hudson Bay. And I just love this concept because what you can see in this map is the 3 polar bear subpopulations that share the Hudson Bay, as well as the traditional territories of the 4 different Indigenous groups that call Churchill home. So you've got the Caribou Inuit, who would come down from the north to trade in Churchill. The Sayasai Dene, often known as the Caribou people that would come from inland. The Swampy Cree, which would typically come up from the south to trade. And we'll talk a little bit more about other important trade locations on Hudson Bay, as well as the Métis people. And so it's really interesting to look at polar bears and polar bear conservation overlaid with Indigenous knowledge and the peoples that have, knowledge of this land and the animals for time immemorial. So when we started this project, which is in the polar bear capital of the world, we were looking at Indigenous knowledge. And of course, because of the tourism in Churchill, much of the knowledge has some relation to tourism from the last 30, 40 years, which is super interesting. And when we started this project, I came to Churchill, and my theory behind this whole work was community-based participatory research. And what that means is that I wanted to try to have the community involved in every single step of the research project, from designing it to the analysis and all the way through the dissemination of results. And one thing my advisors suggested was that I find a co-researcher to have co-produced knowledge. And that is where Georgina came in. So my first visit to the community just for this research project, I was just having tea with people. And really my goal was to find someone who was a really good listener that was interested in this project. And I just feel so fortunate that I found Georgina to work together on this study. And so one thing Georgina and I did when we decided to work together is we used this method called engaged acclimatization. And that just means essentially spending time together. And for me, as a white researcher from the South, to become more embedded and develop more of a cultural understanding of Churchill and the histories there. So what Georgina and I did is we actually did a trip to York Factory together, and we designed our research project on that trip. And so, Georgina, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the significance of York Factory and what that trip meant to you, and how it sort of set the scene for our work together.
So York Factory is the area where my mother and her family, our ancestors, had been settled there for many years, thousands of years, before the Hudson Bay Company came to settle there as well. And they had like a trade relationship with my ancestors, my grandpa and my uncles, and they were the hunters, and they trapped for furs, and they had a trade relationship with the Hudson Bay Company. My father worked for the Hudson Bay Company there at York Factory for 27 years, and that is where he met my mother. They stayed there at York Factory for until 1957, when the government kind of forced a relocation to this area of Churchill because the couple of things affecting the Hudson Bay companies. It wasn't as good as it was before, so they were sending people away from that area, and because of that, our parents were relocated to Churchill here. So when Katie had asked if I wanted to go and do this trip to York Factory, I had done it before at the 100th commemoration of the signing of the treaty in 1910. So in 2010, we went there as a family, and we got to see all of our relatives, and we got to see how they would have lived on the land as they did before. We spent about a week there with our ancestors. So the second time that Katie and I were going, it was a different trip in that it was more, remembering or feeling the feelings that my ancestors would have had traveling that land and navigating it, and really getting into how they had known that land so intimately, and that it was their survival. And so that second trip was with KT was so eye-opening, in that I got to feel the feelings they were feeling. It's such beautiful country out there, and so that trip was something else, and to feel even traveling the water was a little bit treacherous that day, and but to even that added to the trip of how later on I hear stories of our ancestors traveling that land and having to navigate it every day. They talk about that. They talk about it being hard waters to travel, and we did see that that day.
And it was just such a treat to travel this route that Georgina's family traveled. And along the way, we decided what research questions we would ask when we did our sharing circles. And for me, I learned so much about the landscape of Indigenous people and how they were relocated to Churchill from different areas. So together, with Georgina, as well as with the Indigenous knowledge keepers in the community, we came up with this research question, which is what Indigenous knowledge can be gathered about coexisting or living with polar bears. And we looked at it from time-based themes. So the distant past, sort of intergenerational knowledge, the past, the present, just like Georgina today, hearing bear bangers outside her window just last night. And then sort of the future. What are people's visions for the future in this area? And so we decided that we would gather this knowledge through storytelling instead of interviews. And we decided that our very first question that we would ask was just, do you remember the first time you ever saw a polar bear? And that was such a magical question. And I believe that was your idea, Georgina, to start with that question. And I wanted to sort of toss it to you and ask you once again, do you remember the very first time you ever saw a polar bear?
I can't remember the first time I saw a polar bear, but every time I see a polar bear, my heart just thumps and I get so excited. And it's not a fear. It's sort of like this excitement, about these massive, beautiful animals that we live with. And it could be a dangerous thing, but most of the time it's kind of like a respectful thing. I think if you don't bother them, they're not going to bother you. And but I do remember trying to get to school one day, and we had come out of our house at the flats there, and just right to the left of us was a bear sitting there, and we just closed the door, went back in, let our heart settle back to a normal thumping and waited, and that's about all you can do is sit and wait. And back then there was no telephones or cell phones to call the polar bear alert, and it wasn't even polar bear alert. You just waited, and that's my earliest experience with the polar bear.
Mm-hmm. And just starting with that question was so fun. And we decided to do the research in small groups. So it would be fun because people would remind each other of stories. They'd be like, no, that wasn't the first time. The first time was with Uncle so-and-so. Don't you remember that? And they would bounce off of each other, these different groups. So Georgina, could you share a little bit about like the storytelling and then how we decided who would be included in the research project?
Yeah, so I remember we were sitting at PBI House, and there was 4 of us Indigenous knowledge keepers that came together to talk about the project and give it our blessing and talk about what it might look like. And there was the 4 of us, and we were sharing stories about our first time of seeing a polar bear. And it just felt so natural. It felt like it revitalized our art of storytelling that Indigenous people have, and I have lived with these women in this community for, 50 plus years. But that evening, I felt so close to them because we were able to sit and talk and share stories, and like I said, it's natural to come together and visit, and just like my mom and her sisters did in the past, so it felt so good to do that. And then I remember Katie was with her sticky notes, and she was saying, okay, who would you like to involve in this research project? And we decided that, elders would be really good to include. And then another person said, well, it'd be really good to have the youth, their perspective of this whole thing. And then, of course, the in-between. And so we came up with about 18 names, maybe more. And we had them all on the sticky notes, and the sticky notes were all on the table there. And then we decided to group them. And I'll let Katie tell her story about the grouping and how it came so natural and worked out perfectly. Each group was perfect for each setting.
Yeah, it was so funny because we had a couple younger participants we wanted to include, and there were 3 young women in particular. And I just asked the knowledge keepers, I said, what about these 3, young women together? What do you think? Would that be a good combination for a sharing circle? And they said, oh, yeah, that's a great combo. We should have those 3 together. So then I reached out and I messaged those 3 to see if they would be willing to participate. And they just started laughing and they said, did they tell you that we're all related? And I said, no, I didn't know you were all related. And so some of them were cousins and there was an auntie, and they were so excited. And we just had so much fun sitting and sharing stories together. And there was a lot of laughter and a lot of joy. And I think some of our most unique and interesting future visions came from some of the youth participants, which was just incredible. So kind of going back to the research project a little bit, and this is just so fun. We've got some bears on the polar bear cam. So we held 10 sharing circles with 18 different Indigenous community members. And those participants identified as elders, knowledge keepers, hunters, trappers, and as working in ecotourism in a variety of capacities. And we sat and did sharing circles with everyone. And then after we did the sharing circles, we recorded audio. And I took all that audio back and I went through it all and analyzed it all, and tried to find themes. So, I would write down keywords of things people said, and then I grouped those into themes, and I brought those themes back to the community. And so the 5 themes kind of came out of that. And those 5 themes were industry and economy, research and management, bear awareness, culture of coexistence. And here I have lost my notes. I'm trying to remember the final one. Let's see. Yes, of course. The one where my bias came out as a researcher. I named it Indigenous knowledge, and I came back to the community and everyone said, no, this whole thing is Indigenous knowledge. And I was like, oh, duh, of course. So this was more the biology and ecology of bears, the Indigenous knowledge that came up about that. So we brought these sticky notes back to the community, and we rearranged them and changed names and validated it with the community. And then I took that back, and I wanted to make these podcasts for the community because, with research, one of the main challenges is that it gets published as an academic paper. And if you're doing research with Indigenous people, most people are never going to go read that. And it's also written in a way that's not super accessible. Of course, it's super important for knowledge building and those sorts of things, right? But it was really important for me to have results of the research for the community and for the participants. So I took those 5 themes and I looked at what knowledge came about for the distant past, the present, and the future. And I organized those into podcasts. And as you can see here in this figure on the left, it was really interesting that, a lot of the knowledge from the distant past had been lost during the relocation. And people spoke about that quite openly in the storytelling. So that was super fascinating. So that was our results, and I wrote it up into my thesis, but we also shared the podcast with the community. So I came back this past summer, and Georgina and I went and we sat with all the participants and we listened to stories. And Georgina, I don't know, do you want to share what that was like to sit down with people and re-listen to the stories and share them?
Yeah, it was kind of confirming, that storytelling was the best way to go, that it was a natural for us, and that it brought out the things we needed to know, but not in a stressful kind of way. It was something that we could all contribute to. And I think that was the greatest part of all of this, was that it was we had to work together, and that's what we did to find out what we need to know.
Yeah, it was super beautiful and just fun. And it was so fun for everyone to hear each other's stories. So with that, I just want to dive briefly into the results of the project. And, we kind of organized them by time period. So as we've mentioned, in the distant past, a lot of intergenerational knowledge was lost. And, the data showed that was in large part due to the relocation of many people to Churchill, from places like York Factory and to Dooley Lake. And so then the next time period, one more note on the distant past is really at that time, the economy on the shores of the Hudson Bay was the fur trade. The fur trade was a huge part of life, and was how many, many people, made a living, per se, that and subsistence lifestyle along the coastline. And of course, that has changed over time. So moving to the past, and we defined the past in this project as the time period after people were relocated. So the past is sort of after the relocation in 1957 up until the closing of the open dump. And this was a really interesting time period in Churchill. And I think we have a short selection of podcasts from this time period. that we might be able to play for you. So this is not the entire podcast, but this is just a short selection of Indigenous knowledge of the past.
Because a lot of people say that the military would take polar bear hides home
Interesting.
when they left here.
Uh-huh.
And that's probably why
Yeah, they had
we
them on
don't
their walks.
remember a lot of bears.
Mm-hmm.
But in those days, there was 5,000 people here. You have to understand, there wasn't too many polar bear encounters in those days when the military was here. Every major and every colonel went home with a polar bear rug.
We had an actual pit of garbage that was constantly being burned. And if you wanted to see a bear, that's where you went. And it wasn't really good for pictures.
There was still like a big fire pit that was pretty much constantly burning. It kind of gives me like Scar from the Lion King.
Yeah, exactly like that. Yeah.
Yeah, the dump was huge. Like, I remember going for a ride at night and seeing anywhere from 10 to 15 bears on the road, no problem.
There's one thing about those bears, like all those years they went to the dump here. As soon as that ice freezes, from the youngest bear to the oldest bear, there's no garbage bag that will hold them. Once the ice freezes, they're gone. That's how they must do well out there too. That time of year comes, they're gone.
I enjoyed clicking berries along that way.
Oh, yeah.
And you never worried about if
I
a bear
never
was going to
did,
come?
no. When I was young, like I said, when we were younger, we didn't have to worry about polar bears.
Because we used to go all over the place.
Everywhere in those
Up on the
bushes,
rocks.
everywhere.
Yeah, and way down there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it was just so fun to hear people's stories and collect them. And Georgina and I, we can see each other in the behind the scenes. We're both just smiling as we're listening to the voices because it's so fun. But, in the past, the key things to understand the Churchill context were really that, management was basically through shooting bears. There was heavy harvest by the military and formerly an open dump, which has been moved into a closed facility since 2005. And every participant recalled, people would play all over the rocks. They didn't really worry about polar bears. And then once the military left and the open dump closed, people started to see a lot more polar bears coming through town. So moving on into the present, there was so much knowledge from the present, and it was such a joy to collect that knowledge. And again, I believe we have a short selection of audio from the present. And this audio is quite fun. And I will just preface this selection that there's two names that come up over and over. And those two names are conservation officers. They're local conservation officers that are highly valued and cherished by the community.
And one time she was barking and we woke up and it was actually at the front of the house. And it was trying to get into the dumpster at the apartment block. And we realized after that it was like an older, experienced bear because we'd called Polar Bear Alert. They drove by and that bear hid from Polar Bear Alert. They recognized the truck. They tucked back into the dark. And then once the truck passed by, they went to go look for it somewhere else. He came out and we called them back. They were like, it's hiding right there. It was right in between the apartments and the dumpster. And it's just cool to see how smart they are in that way to just know, recognize a vehicle and be able to make that assumption and associate it with that and hide.
And my mom would just wag her finger at me and she'd be like, no, you can't walk home on the pipeline. And that one's the scary spot for bears. And Jack and Donald are always parked up on there some mornings. Just call Jack and Donald.
Jack and Donald.
Jack and Donald.
Or
you see Jack and Donald, I was walking one day and Jack had heard something down farther down the road, but he stopped me and he's like, hey, get in, I'll drive into town real quick, and then I gotta go chase this guy out.
It's crazy because as much as we've dealt with bears, that second you're just in panic mode. It's you're fucking screaming and I was literally screaming on the phone talking to Jack. And Jack basically said, it's like, he knew who I was. And he's just like, calm down, Katie. I can't understand a word you're saying. Where's the bear? It's like, okay, sorry, Jack.
Yeah. So my last year of teaching, 2018, we were looking out the kindergarten window, and there's Jack. He's got a bear in the ball diamond, and there's like fence all around it except one way out.
Mm-hmm.
And there's Jack walking around.
Yeah, all
with his
calmly.
gun, and he's saying, "You get out of here! You get out of here!" The bear's running around, and he's doing the bases, and then a home run, and then away he went. Jack is so calm, like it's like this is just his everyday thing, eh? It was so cute. But it must have been a young bear, because you know, it went to first base and second base and third base and then home and then out. It's so cute.
So that one's just super fun, really sharing how much people cherish the conservation officers, the local conservation officers, and just the story in the baseball diamond from Georgina looking out the kindergarten window is just so neat. And things have changed a lot. And in the present, you know, one thing people talked a lot about, Georgina, was kind of how they teach their kids to be bear aware. Could you talk a little bit about like how you raised your kids with bear awareness and how that was different from when, you know, you were a kid growing up on the flats?
Yeah, so when my children were younger, of course, there's the one-liners, don't go on the pipeline. And so we always taught them not to walk in areas that the polar bears might be. We always told them to walk together, have a buddy system. We told them that they shouldn't be walking after dark. And if they did have to go out after dark, we would give them a ride. You know, and of course, you got to live while you're living in bear country. And so, you know, they would go tobogganing and they would just, like us, learn to look around frequently and make sure that they weren't putting themselves in danger. But parents nowadays, they just don't even take that chance. They just drive their children everywhere, and children don't get the fresh air that they need nowadays because they're driven to the complex, driven back home. They rarely have to walk on their own. And, you know, that might be a good thing, but, you know, we're so afraid. I have a grandson now who's 12, and I seem to be always phoning in the evening to say, is he home yet? And if he's not home yet, could I go and pick him up? And his mom always says, no, he's okay. He will get home. He's doing the buddy system, remember? But yeah, it's different nowadays.
And that's just the way of life in Churchill, which is so interesting and unique. So then we had the future visions part of the results, and participants had many visions for the future of living with or coexisting with polar bears. And we don't have time to go through all of them today, but I do believe we have one final short clip of the podcasts, a selection of some of the future visions related to culture and the culture of coexisting with polar bears.
We always think of what are we leaving, you know, our children, our grandchildren. And just like there's 7 sacred teachings, it's been said that you're always thinking 7 generations behind you, knowledge-wise, where you are present and what it looks 7 generations moving forward.
We are kind of in a good direction now. I feel like better than before, but definitely like incorporating more locals and like local knowledge is key. I think a big emphasis is not only local, but like Indigenous knowledge as well. Like, especially like the people who have lived here for years and years, and like different generations of families, and even people like the Inuit who have a totally different relationship with polar bears than say like the Cree might have, and just like learning from the different perspectives, and that really ties into knowing what's dangerous and what's not around town.
I think all animals need to be treated with love and respect, even though we eat them, right? Like we harvest them. But so we harvest our animals as quickly as we can and we share, with Indigenous culture sharing. But with polar bears, I think that they're a real spiritual animal, and they're part of our ecosystem, and I think that they're, you can see, because Indigenous people, the connection to the land is through the animals, right? And we watch these animals and we watch the polar bear rise, and we're all concerned about their future. And I think that it's up to us, to make sure that we're doing our part, to make sure that the conservation continues and that these animals are around here for my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren and my great-great-grandchildren, because Churchill's so special.
So the coexistence thing is pretty critical. So, and it's quite unique. So I think the community is pretty proud of this being dubbed, polar bear capital of the world. And again, we've got to do our part to make sure that we're improving on it.
In the next year, as the research gets finalized, and there'll be places where everyone can go to see the full future visions, results, and recommendations. I think we have time now. We could take just a couple questions. And Georgina, in closing, did you want to share anything about future visions or anything else related to the project?
No, not that. I just wanted to thank you once again for, doing this project and having the commitment that you had to follow through. And I know it was a lot of work, and you just done it up so beautifully, Katie. I want to thank you for that. Just warms my heart.
It's been my joy. It's been such a joy. And it's so important to find ways to bridge and braid and weave Indigenous knowledge and science. And it's super important for us to do this into the future. And this project and storytelling, I think, provides a way to do that is more inclusive and inherent to an Indigenous worldview through storytelling, right? And so as researchers in polar bear conservation and beyond, and in all sorts of research today, people are looking to find new ways to bridge and braid Indigenous knowledge. So hopefully this project can inspire others, and these new methods can possibly be used for other knowledge gathering. With that, I'll toss it back to Alysa and see if we have any questions. And if not, we'll wrap it up.
Well, just two quick ones. First, really briefly, just on the triplets that people might be seeing on the cam here. So it has been an amazing last few days on the cams. There are multiple family groups out there on the tundra, including that mom with triplets. There is a runt of that litter who's quite small. There's a good chance that little cub won't make it into adulthood, but this mama is doing an amazing job. This morning, she's been fighting off males, keeping her cubs safe. It's just been really incredible to watch. So we hope that you'll continue to join us in the coming days and maybe weeks as we continue to watch the polar bears for as long as they're on land. Today, thank you both again so much. That was so beautiful. And knowing Katie before this project, and then as she met you and took on this project, and then watching it grow over the last couple of years, it's just been, I haven't been a direct part of the journey, but I feel like I've been watching it, and I've been just so impressed the whole time. And this is really, the polar bears want to be out on the sea ice. As soon as this ice is back, they'll be out there, they'll be hunting. But when they are in town, it is so incredible to know what knowledge is here about them, how the community views them and is living with them. And Churchill has so much to teach the rest of the North when it comes to living with polar bears. That will be something that is a growing concern in the coming years. So just a couple quick questions, then we do have to, well, we had one already, we do have to wrap up, but I'll just have one for you, Georgina, here. So it's been told often that everyone in Churchill leaves their car doors open so anybody can run inside in case there's danger. Is that a true thing here?
That is, yeah. And even our houses, our doors are never locked. Our car doors are kept open. And that's so anyone that's trying to get out of the bear's way can get into somewhere safely.
Another way the community can take care of each other, watching out for each other. Well, with that, unfortunately, time flies and we have to start wrapping up. But if you have any questions for Georgina or KT or want to know more about this project, KT, how can people find out more?
They can reach out with Polar Bears International. They'll get passed along to me. We'll be publishing some more information hopefully soon. We're just waiting for things to be finalized with the university. But stay tuned on Polar Bears International's website and other channels for more updates in the coming months.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today, for caring about polar bears, for watching the cams. Thanks to Frontiers North Adventures, who is donating us Tundra Buggy One, who's out there with these polar bears on the cam right now. And massive thanks to Explore.org, our streaming partner. They help us bring polar bears to you all over the world. These Churchill polar bears are pretty special, and we know they can be appreciated by the world. And the more we understand something, the more we love it, and the more we can work to protect it together. So we are here for the polar bears, but we're also definitely here for the people. And thank you, Georgina.
You're welcome.
So much for being here today. Stay tuned. We've got another live chat next week. It's kind of one of the wrap-up ones, but if the bears continue to be here, then so will we. Thanks again, KT, for tuning and joining us today from afar. Miss you up here. But we're so happy for your new endeavors and just so impressed by your work. And thank you to all the viewers, and enjoy these polar bears. We'll keep watching these triplets as long as we can. And thanks to Albert behind the scenes for putting all this together. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. A polar bear's life cycle is almost exclusively tied to the sea ice. Because polar bears rely on sea ice to hunt, to breed, and sometimes to den, sea ice loss from climate change is their biggest threat, and the reason the bears are listed as vulnerable on the IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species. What we learn about climate change impacts on polar bears in Hudson Bay can be applied across the Arctic to help conserve other populations. Climate change is already affecting some populations of polar bears. Since we get most of our energy from fossil fuels, we are producing huge amounts of carbon dioxide. You see, regular amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere act like a blanket around the Earth, trapping heat and keeping our planet at a stable temperature. However, when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy, we pump rampant amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This buildup thickens the blanket, trapping too much heat, disrupting the climate, and melting Arctic sea ice. When Arctic waters are cold enough, the top layer freezes into a special type of ice called sea ice. Sea ice is to the ocean what soil is to a forest. It supports the entire Arctic food chain. Food from this marine ecosystem also sustains northern communities. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic, is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. Because together, we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.